Fantastic to have you. Got a great guest today, Sharon Robson, my great friend. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Tony. Like you just said, I'm great.
I'd expect nothing less. If you're watching, don't forget, join us at remoteaf.co. Click the community button and join our wonderful community where we're talking about many of the things that you'll hear about today. Join our newsletter, Team Craft. You can sign up for that. Find that in the show notes, along with any of the notes and things that Sharon talks upon today. We'll stop the advertising stuff and we'll move into the real stuff. Sharon, we got you here today for a really important reason. We want to talk about agility and crisis management, which is something that you're very passionate about. Let's talk about that a little bit. Why? Why are you getting into this?
Excellent. So agility, right? It's not just about delivering things. Agility is about setting your organization up for success. And one of the things that we talk about with agility is resilience. So I thought, okay, let's explore this a bit. And then I stumbled across a course that I went on that talked about crisis management and business resiliency. And I thought, this is going to be excellent. This is going to be so cool. So I went along to see what the overlap was between agility, crisis management, and resilience. And it was really an interesting experience.
So talk to me a little bit about that, because I saw a diagram from a talk that you did, where you really talked about the fact that there's the three approaches do overlap, and you have agility, lean, and systems thinking. But then instead of going, business agility, et cetera, you're saying like crisis management is a set of very important tools to deal with all this disruption and the disruptive events, right? And then the business resilience, you're talking about the mindsets and methods. So let's talk a little bit about how you see them all gelling together.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the big thing is we all know from our working in agility that it's all about systems thinking, joining the dots, creating those ecosystems that maximize our ability to create value for our customers, create value for our organizations. So, all of those lean and system thinking mindsets provide that. But when you couple it with resilience, it actually expands the scope that we're talking about, because you're not just talking about the mechanics of getting an idea out of people's heads into our customers' hands through our value stream. What we're actually talking about is the bigger picture of the ongoing nature of the organization. So it's beyond delivery. It's beyond creation of a new product or service. It's about how do we create the organization that is able to deal with whatever comes along. And that's resilience. Can you actually deal with whatever comes along? Now, at a team level, you can break that down and say, are we building for intrinsic quality? Are we building products and services that are resilient and robust and deal with circumstances? Are we doing that? But then when you couple that back to the agility approach of thinking holistically and thinking about the business and thinking longer term, you start to see resilience coming in from a business perspective. So what are our mindsets, and what is the methods that we can use to help us think about setting our organization up for success come what may? And that's a big thing. And that's where the crisis management comes in, because, the title of the talk, the black swans are coming. These are the tools and techniques that we need to be aware of to allow us to really think through, are we able to deal with stuff? And this is something that I don't think we pay enough attention to in the workplace. With agility, we talk about iterative working patterns, learning and adjusting. We want to be proactive around our risk management. We talk about all of those things as fundamentals of agility. When you start to talk about business resiliency and crisis management, those agility mindsets can be pulled into the wider organization. But flip side, the wider organization view of crisis management can then be pulled into our agility mindset. And we can say, oh, how does this play out? What does this mean to us? And what it does is it means that you actually start to form different cross-functional teams. You start to have different feedback loops. You start to collect different metrics. You start to look at the world through a different eye. So I can just very quickly, if you want, share my screen to show you the diagram that I'm
do so.
Is that
ourselves while you prepare something for the audience?
No, here it is. I'm ready.
Okay.
So that's the diagram. Can you see that one?
I need to let it up on the screen. There you go.
Yeah. Can you see that?
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Awesome. So, that's the diagram that we're talking about. And what we're looking for here is, just this ability to bring these things together and to create modern working practices.
Yeah, it's a great diagram, and I think the interesting thing with that is how you brought them together. And as I said, an admission, right? I wrote a white paper recently about dynamically adaptive organisations and business and becoming resilient. And I wish that you'd done this talk before I wrote that white paper. I wish that I had put this in there, which is why I was so keen to have you on here. So, and for me, the things you're talking about there match into a dynamically adaptive organisation, because those organisations that have become dynamically adaptive are building that resilience, come what may, come what black swans, or they've dealt with them, right? So I think that's a really interesting direction that you're taking in. So you started to delve into that, and you're thinking about things like threat identification. That was an interesting piece for me. Talk to me a little bit about what you were talking about when you were talking about that threat identification, because you got to know what's coming, right? Or what
you do. And I'm just going to share another picture here, because this is one of my favorites, I suppose. And when I when I talk about threat identification, one of the things that we need to really pay attention to is that it's not what you expect. So one of the things that I do talk about, we talk about it in agility a lot, is innovation. But what I want to talk about is what I call disaster innovation. And you're like, what? What is disaster innovation? But disaster innovation is where we do our traditional risk management, and we talk about probability and impact on the X and Y axes. And the red quadrant is what we call, or I call, the OMG quadrant. All right, so that's what the red quadrant is. It's like, OMG, we have to deal with this. We've got to lean into it. But then the yellow quadrant, the one with the amber one with the one with the black swan in it, they're what I call the WTF. And they're the things that come out of nowhere, we're not expecting, and they're the things that are going to really, really disrupt us. So I'll give you an example. Optus.
A very poignant example for the Australian.
Yeah, right. So if I said to you as an organisation, what would you do if one of Australia's major telcos had an outage that lasted upwards of a whole business day and took out all of your point of sale systems, or all of your ability to communicate with your team, and all of your ability to access your systems inside your organisation?
Yep.
The first thing you'd say is, that'd never happen. And then I would say, well, what if it did? What have we got prepared for it? And people, they push back and they say, they're never going to happen. It's never going to happen. And so, Optus, thank you very much. Very timely for them to do that for me. I appreciate it. But let's talk about Optus. Let's talk about a 2-year global pandemic that's going to shut down.
Yeah, that'll never happen.
It's going to shut down the world. Never happen. Instantly remote workforces. We are going to be working in a 100% remote environment for upwards of 12 months, and then we're going to be slowly trying to figure out how do we work in a hybrid environment for the next 3 years. Yeah. Never going to happen. Don't worry about that. Shit gets stuck sideways in the Suez Canal. Lots of supply lines for months and months and months. That'll never happen. Never happen. But seriously, here's a catalogue of things that have happened. All right, here's one. Swine flu in China. And you're like, what? Okay, so you want to see what happens to the cost of living when we take pork products out of every stage of our supply line. Yeah. Every stage of our supply line, you want to see what happens to the cost of living there.
Yeah. So it's such a brittle supply chain. So many brittle supply chains and so many brittle timeline interventions that can create such havoc throughout the organisations that we have today. And then obviously that permeates its way into our society, right?
100%. And that supply chain visibility and transparency was where the systems thinking comes in. So when we're thinking about crisis management and we're in the OMG quadrant, so that red quadrant, it's all about us. It's all about us. It's what's going to happen to us and what are we going to do and what is the worst thing that could happen to us. But when you move into the WTF quadrant and you start to talk about your black swans, then you start to look at your supply chain.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we talked about was the levels in your supply chain. So you have in your supply chain, you have your tier 1 suppliers, your tier 2 suppliers, and your tier 3 suppliers. You can go on exponentially, it's up to you. But your tier 1 suppliers are your suppliers, vendors, partners who work directly with you. And that's what we saw play out with Optus. Okay, so we saw a whole bunch of people who had Optus as a tier 1 supplier, and all of a sudden they couldn't get access to their internet or their financial systems, all of those things. Okay. However, the play out in the media is indicating that what actually happened was Optus had a failure because of one of their partners. So their partners are your tier 2 suppliers. And you may or may not have visibility of them. And then when we go out to tier 3 suppliers, which are the suppliers of your suppliers, then you're going to have lack of visibility, right? But here's where the systems thinking comes in, because when we start to talk about black swans, there are other black swans we need to be aware of. When we're talking about the OMG quadrant, we're thinking about us and we look at our local environment. Every disaster starts locally and ends locally, but can get real big and then real small real quick. So everything starts locally and ends locally. But when you start to look at the black swans, you start to look at the possibility of governments being overthrown. What? What's that got to do with us here in Australia? Safe, sound, benign. We have a really stable government. Yeah, but how many of us do outsourcing to countries that don't have stable governments?
Yeah.
Right? Because we're always looking for how do we make really good economic decisions locally. And so now we outsource our workforce, or our supply, if we're manufacturing or anything like that, to a country that doesn't have a stable government. What happens if they have a coup? What happens if their borders shut? Right? So the supply chain and the tiers in our supply chain are the things that we've got to look at. And that's why these black swans are so important, because you have to be situationally aware through your supply chain. I mean, Ukraine, the impact of the war in Ukraine on software development, because very, very few people realize that there's a bucket load of software that comes out of that part of Europe. So that the southeast part of Europe is a mammoth software generation. Same in Israel. Israel has a huge software industry.
Yes.
They're currently being severely impacted. So, these are the black swans that you don't think are coming, but they're coming. And then there's the big one, like the biggest, the slowest moving disaster that we're all seeing, but no one's doing anything about. I'm going to say it. I'm going to call it climate change.
Say it out loud.
Yeah, I'm going to say it. Right? It's climate change. Now, I did climatology and meteorology as my undergraduate degree long time ago. And we talked about climate change literally 30 years ago as being So very, very important. But, from our event horizons, all we think about is it's not us yet. So we're still thinking about it in the OMG quadrant,
Yeah.
but it's starting to appear in the WTF quadrant all of the time now. Right? All of the time we're seeing the impacts of it.
Particularly here in Australia, every single day, right?
Exactly.
Wild storms, fires. Here in Queensland, in Australia, where you and I are situated, there are massive firestorms. So I concur with you on that. What I'm interested in, I love that you've got the quadrants, but you don't just talk about what it is, you talk about how to fix it, right? Or how to apply against it. So let's talk a little bit about that. So starting with, you have the concept of the crisis timeline. Let's.
Yep.
I think that's a good place to start. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, because you do author of.
Yeah, I know. So the one thing that we need to realize when we are talking about crisis management, and this is where the agility, iterative mindset really comes in, is when you have a crisis, it's not event recovery. It doesn't work like that. Okay. So there is a timeline associated with it, and I'll just share this one with you as well, because it's really interesting to think about in terms of what does this mean for us as an organization, in that it is not just the one and done situation. It is us being able to actually look at it and say, you know what, here we've got an event. Okay, so an event happens, and we've got two stages. We've got our response stage, and then we've got our recover stage. Totally different ways of thinking and working. The mindset is different, the timeline is different, the attitudes are different. And with your crisis management, you have to do something about it. You have to deal with it. But then you've got the recover stage, and you've got to iterate through these. Both stages, you've got to iterate through them, because what you thought is the thing is not necessarily the thing, and it's going to evolve. And crises evolve over time. So the next thing to realize is you can't just one and done it. It has to be prolonged and profound. But the big thing is when you have a crisis, event happens, productivity, engagement, ability to work with each other, all of those things off the cliff. And anyone working in agility knows that we've got change management and the change curve. This is like not a gentle descent. This is, you are off the cliff, you're in free fall. Crisis, all bets are off. So you've got to manage the crisis iteratively. Then when you say we are no longer experiencing the event, that's when you need to put in place your resiliency approaches. And this is your transition plan. And this is where you start to say, okay, what are the number one business critical things that we need to get up and running? And then what are our number two? And then what are our number three? So when it comes to agility, this is our visibility and transparency of our priorities. It's the having the right people in the room. It's avoiding the white noise. It's cutting through the static that is in everyone's heads, because whenever a crisis happens, everyone's like, oh, and what you actually need to do is calm down. So having an awareness of the timeline, that it's not event recovery, is super important, because then you can manage your way through it. You can work your way through it.
I've got a great question here for you. The question is, you're talking about using agility. What if we're not an agile organization, or we don't have agile at all?
It's a great question. You're using the principles and the practices of agility where you can, but most of us can also default to common sense. And I don't mean to sound patronizing when I say that. What I talk about when I talk about agility is not story points and planning poker. What I talk about is visibility, transparency, and working as a team.
Yeah.
And most organizations can apply those principles, making things visible and available, being transparent and having open and honest conversations with each other, but also working as a team. So this is where crisis management and cross-functional team structures really come into play. Because in a crisis, your C-suite is the ultimate cross-functional team. If they're not working as a team, nothing is going to be resolved. And the team is not only the C-suite, it's the key players in the organization, it's the decision makers, but it's also about the people who hold the information. So when we talk about a team in crisis, it is from the top to the bottom of the organization, from the most senior leader to the most junior person on the ground, connecting those information streams and connecting those decision points. David Marquette in Turn the Ship Around basically applied agility inside a nuclear submarine. He just didn't call it that. He called it leadership, which is just fabulous. But he talked about taking the authority to the information. And when you're working in a crisis, information is the most important part. When you're working in agility, information is the most important part. Feedback loops and listening to what's going on. We were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, that's right. So the conversation Sharon and I had previously, I think a lot of people forget that agility or agile, its stock and trade is information flow. It's the information flow, whether that be velocity, that's information flow, but information flow that allows you to make those adaptive decisions and pivot and change in the short, sharp cycles that it offers. Right? And I think that's a really good point you made, Sharon. And the other thing I think I like that you make there is also talking about leadership, not management. So there's a big difference in that in these particular situations. Talk to me a little bit about it, because I really like your thoughts on that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the fundamental, absolutely fundamental bottom line, cannot forget, crises happen to people. Okay? You manage things, you lead people. So in a crisis or in a time when you need deep resiliency, you need people, which means you need leadership. And what you're doing is you're making sure that everything that you are doing inside the crisis as a leader is human-centric. You always default to, are people safe?
Yeah.
Is the environment safe? I mean, finance, you can always recover financially, right? You can always recover financially. If you haven't got that trust inside the organization, and if your organization mindset isn't around the fact that my leaders are there for me, and if your leaders aren't there for their people, the crisis will destroy you.
Yeah.
Because you haven't got trust. You haven't got that engagement. You haven't got that default that is, we're all looking after each other. And that's true teamwork played out.
Interesting question for you. What if our leaders don't buy in?
Right. Now, this is such a big question, and it is such a situation that we're looking at across the board at the moment. There is a disconnect. I hate to say it, there is a disconnect. We see it a lot in the agile community, but I'm seeing it in organizations that aren't just agile, like the other organizations I work with, because what we're seeing is there is this idea that there's the body of the organization, and then there's the leaders, and the leaders can say to the organization, go forth and be agile, or go forth and do the thing, and go forth and become this new thing, or here's your OKRs, go and achieve them, without getting the feedback loops back up to leadership.
Yeah.
And there is that disconnect. There is this 100% disconnect. But like all things, it shows and it plays out. And you can see very, very quickly that when you have disconnected leaders, you have appalling decision-making, and you have an organization that is not making progress. It's not getting ahead of the curve. It's not leaning into the future, and it's not mature. Okay. So disconnected leadership is bigger than crisis management. It's bigger than agility. Sadly, it is common in our workplace, but the result is poor organizational performance. So this is the difference between leaders and managers. People who look at organizations and they manage them are the disconnected leaders. Leaders who are part of an organization, who are actively engaged, who talk, who come to events, who listen to the feedback, all of those things, they're leaders. They want to know what's going on so they can make better informed decisions. Managers, the boss types who sit in their ivory towers and they collect their data from the pre-prepared and packaged reports that don't tell you anything. They just give you poor data and they make decisions on that poor data. That's not leadership. That's just bad management. What can you do when your leadership or your management structures are like that? I want to say get another job, but that's not always possible. I want to say be prepared, be aware, but lean into it. You can't change someone else's mind and their attitudes, but what you can do is you can say, within my scope of reference, within my sphere of influence, I'm going to be proactive. I'm going to be ready. So in a leadership vacuum, you be the leader.
So a question from me to you. So I think in this, the question that strikes me listening to that, do you think we as an agile community or the community of consultancy have caused some of this issue as well? There are so many methods of leadership that, let's do some intent-based, let's do servant, we'll be a servant leader. Let's do red team leading. And not like, I'm not denigrating any of those particular models. I'm just saying there's so many models of leadership being thrown at them. Then wrap around that the black swan moment coming at them, and then all of the different fluctuations. We talk about VUCA. VUCA is not just external; it's internal, caused by that external fluctuation. So, do you think that we've done the best service that we could?
Oh, Tony. No.
Do I leave the room?
No, I don't. You know what? And here's why. So with agility, so often when we engage to help an organization go down its agile journey, we focus at team level, and we focus on the practices. Here's how you do planning poker. Here's how you write a good story. Here's how you put Jira into your system. Who cares? That's not agility. They're the mechanics. What we want to be focusing on is the mindset and the behaviors associated with agility. So I work a lot to divorce agility from the practices, because I get so many people saying to me, what's best practice? And I say, well, listen, I can't tell you that, because as soon as I say that planning poker is best practice, someone's going to invent a better one. And you're going to not do the better one because Sharon said planning poker is the best practice. And I'm going to say, no, tell you what, it's all about context. If planning poker works for you, do it. If it doesn't, don't. I'm having this great conversation last week around story points. Should we use story points? And I said, why do you use them? And they said, well, we use them to convert them into hours and days. I'm like, well, convert them to hours and days. Please. It's like, don't use them because you're actually adding steps into the process. So anyway, back to leadership. Yes, we have done it wrong, because the agile industrial complex focuses on team level, because we haven't got the courage to talk to the leaders about what it means to them. And we haven't got the courage to say to leaders, agility starts in the C-suite.
Yeah.
If you don't do it at the top of the organization, doesn't matter how many times we push agility through the teams, not going to work. If you're not doing it at the top, but none of us have the courage to do that. Well, few of us have the courage to do it. Flip side, few of our leaders have the courage to lean into it as well. But if you're looking around at successful agile transformations, if you're looking around at organizations who got through COVID, who got through the Suez Canal, who got through Optus, who got through it well, you're looking at agile organizations. You're looking at resilient organizations. Now, they may not do agility out of the box or are following any of the frameworks, but what they're doing is the mindset and the behaviors of visibility, transparency, and working as a team, but they're also doing the other things that are so important. They're doing the deliberate practice of higher order thinking, decision making, and problem solving.
Yeah.
Now, the deliberate practice is really, really important because it means it's not just happening automatically. It's not on autopilot. It is deliberate. You are saying, I need to harness my craft.
I've got a really good question that's popped in there. I just want to pop that up on screen. There we go. There you go. I love that.
That is a good question.
It is a good question.
Well, you say, hi, boss, can we have a chat? No. All right, so it's not that easy, right? You can, all right, here's my approach. We, these days, are what we call knowledge workers inside knowledge organizations. Very few of our organizations create tangible things, like things you can pick up or put on a shelf. Most organizations in the corporate world these days create intangible things, products or services that are vaporware, right? They don't physically exist. Now, what that means is inside our organizations, we are knowledge workers. So our role is to come to work and think and learn and apply that thinking and learning. So in the olden days on a production line, you used to have to hammer 57 nails in every hour. These days, you've got to think 57 times every hour. Yeah. So this is the first engagement with your leader. You say, hey, boss, I've just learned something new. Can I talk to you about it? Hey, boss, I've just become aware of this thing. Hey, boss, there's this organization over there who's just like us, but they're doing things differently. Can I talk to you about it? So approach it from a knowledge learning perspective rather than the if we don't do this, we're going to fail perspective. And then open your curiosity as well as theirs. I'm curious to see whether or not we could run an experiment. Could we try this? Would this work here? Can we find out? So you start the conversation. Now, sometimes people are going to say, too busy, not enough time, not enough money, shut up, get your job done. All right, all that stuff. I actually had a project manager once who told me, Sharon, I don't pay you to think. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm in such the wrong job. Right? So I was like, wow. Yeah, we're paid to think. We're paid to learn. We're paid to pay attention. And we're paid to bring that knowledge to the table. Bring it to the table. Talk to your leaders about it, and they'll talk to their leaders, and they'll talk to their leaders.
I want to pick you up on something that you've said a couple of times. Well, I hope that answers your question, escalates quick. But feel free to send some questions to Sharon.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's always happy. I was speaking on your behalf, but I know you said well, you will.
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk.
You talked about changing mindset. So that's an interesting one for me because it's one that really always sort of gets me going, is because a lot of agilists will trot out when they ask you about the mindset, oh, well, it's got to be a growth mindset. You've got to change to a growth mindset. And we need to do something that somebody said 33 years ago to change your growth mindset, right? So when you're talking about changing your mindset, how are you talking about that? What are you thinking about? What are the things you're thinking about in changing the mindsets and how you might change them?
Oh, so many things. So your mindset is such an important concept, right? And the first thing to do is realize that most of us run on autopilot. So your brain is incredibly lazy, and that's because it is actually a massive consumer of your body's energy. So for you to be actively thinking, your brain, which takes somewhere between 2 and 5% of your body mass, actually consumes about 20% of the energy at any one time. So your brain likes to switch off. All right, just that as a baseline. That's your brain likes to switch off. It loves to go into autopilot. It loves to go to habits. So what's the first mindset shift? Recognize your habits. Recognize, are you just thinking this way because that's how you always think? Is it your go-to? Is it easy? Are you switched off? That's the first thing. Okay. And that's self-awareness. And this comes all the way back to EQ and high-performing teams.
Yeah.
So from an EQ perspective, emotional quotient, all right, your ability to be emotionally intelligent. The number one thing for both high EQ and high-performing teams, number one thing, self-awareness. Are you aware of how you think? Really, really, really important. Really good start point. And that's where you start to get into the whole realm of metacognition. We are thinking beings, but there's very few beings in the world that recognize that they think. So metacognition is thinking about thinking. And first thing is, are you aware of how you think? Second thing is once you are aware of how you think, what are your biases? What are the things that get in your way without you even realizing it? This is where you start to get into mental models. We make assumptions faster than you can possibly believe. When you're making assumptions, you are clouding your perception. For you to make good decisions, you need to have clear perceptions. You need to take the blinkers off. So being self-aware, then looking at your biases allows you to then take the blinkers off. And when you take the blinkers off and you start to look at the bigger picture, it's pretty scary. So the first thing that you do is you go all the way back to, oh, I don't want to know, that's too hard. All right. And that's where courage comes in. So then you've got to have the courage or the willingness to do things differently. And it's courage because it hurts. The reason that doing things differently hurts is you're going to get a productivity drop, and ego-based, which is our meritocracy, our Western working practices, is we always reward the best person. So if the best person is the best and they get the money for it, they're not going to change, because the first thing that happens when you change is your productivity goes down. But then you learn and learn and learn and learn, and then you get better. Okay. So that takes courage and it takes time. It's like the crisis management curve. So a lot of people don't want to do that. And the reason we don't want to do that, either as leaders or team members, is because we haven't got time. So first of all, you need to be aware. The second of all, you need to give yourself courage and permission to change. And the third is, do not expect yourself to be an instant expert. It's not going to happen. It takes time to get better at stuff. So they're the mindset shifts. And they're big.
They're big shifts. So I'd add an extra one to that is, don't ask yourself, are you stuck in delivery? How much time are you spending in delivery rather than leading? Actually,
exactly.
Yeah, which goes with those three, I think is fantastic.
Yeah. But that's where your higher order thinking skills come in. So, you look at Bloom's taxonomy and you say, how much am I just repeating a pattern that I already know versus how often am I at the top of the pyramid here doing analysis and synthesis and creation and evaluation? Higher order thinking skills versus lower order thinking skills.
Yeah.
How often am I being proactive about my decision making? How often am I paying attention to how I make decisions? And how often am I working hard to solve the true problem? Not the apparent problem, not the symptom.
Yeah.
What is the true problem?
So I'm going to ask you one more question, because we're running close to the end of time, unfortunately.
Yeah, wow.
It happens quickly, doesn't it? So, and ask all the hard questions here. You talked a lot about transparency as well. And I think that's one of the harder things for organisations to come at, because of the constructs that we've just talked about and the things that are in place. And we've got these black swan events, that transparency piece is going to be so important. Talk to me about how you make that transparency. How do you do that communication? What are the changes you need to make?
Oh, great question. So, oh man, it's so funny. I was working with a group recently, and they were like, Sharon, we've done everything agility. We've put everything into our backlog, and it's all in the tool. I'm going to call the tool Jira, but it doesn't have to be Jira. It's just a lot of people use Jira for this type of thing. We've put stuff in the tool, And we keep getting phone calls from our leaders saying, where are we? What's happening? What's going on? And we say, it's in JIRA. And they say, where is it? What's happening? What's going on? And we say, it's in JIRA. And I said, well, okay, so what you've just identified is the truth. Your leaders are not going to go to JIRA. They're not going to look into that stuff. So our digital tools were meant to be this quick win, silver bullet, instant transparency. Leaders don't go to JIRA. They're not going to do it. They need to have the visibility via roadmaps. They need to have the visibility via showcases. They need to have the visibility and the transparency via conversations. And you know what it means? It means you have to go to them. They're not going to come to you. So you've got to go to them. And you've got to be really open and honest, and you've got to have the hard conversations. The whole point about agility is, after iteration 2 or 3, you know if you're going to make iteration 23. You know whether or not you're on track for it after 2 iterations. So you can have the hard conversation early. And this is what crisis management is about. Have the hard conversation early. And crisis management isn't about waiting for the bad thing to happen. Crisis management is being prepared for the bad thing to happen. So when it does happen, you're ready. So you've got to talk about the ugly things. You've got to talk about the black swans early. And you've got to be really transparent and say, hey, boss, here's this black swan that we've just identified. We're not ready for it. Okay, I'll give you a classic example. Here we go. We all do DR drills. We all do them, hopefully. When was the last time you did a R? When was the last time you restored from your backups? When was the last time you saw if your backups actually worked? When was the last time you checked to see how long it takes to restore from your backups? Now, how many of us are storing our backups remotely? Hopefully most of us. How many of us are considering the black swan event that's going to happen to our remote storage facility? I'm a very cheerful person, I promise.
You've done well this morning. But, they're poignant questions. Greatly rhetorical, of course, but, there are many of those examples for our listeners, here in Australia. It was a very big one where one of our government systems decided to change their payroll system. And when it didn't go well, they couldn't restore the backup because the backup didn't work. And it's all she wrote. It hasn't been fun for a lot of people for a very long time. So there we go.
Very long time.
Sharon, we're at the end of our time. So it's been fantastic to have you on At Talking Remote today. I'd love you to share your presentation on our show notes, if that's okay with you, so that people can see that. Fantastic. How can people get in touch with you?
I'm pretty hard to find. Only joking. I have my own company, so you can find me at www.enterprisingagility.com.au, or you can just email me, sharonr@enterprisingagility.com.au. Plus, Tony knows me.
That's true. I do too. And we'll whack that in the show notes as well. Again, don't forget to join our Remote AF community. Jump on remoteaf.co, click the community button, join that thriving community. We're talking about all things remote, much of the things we're talking about today. We'd love to have you there. Grab our Teamcraft newsletter. You can get that in the link in the show notes as well. It's been fantastic having you on At Talking Remote today. Thanks so much, Sharon.
Oh, Tony, it's a pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Great community. Thank you for inviting me.